Hi everyone, and welcome to today's lesson. Today we're going to be looking at how you can go about making a colour wheel. A colour wheel will help you to explore all the different possible combinations of colours in a particular palette. So when I refer to a palette, I mean the pigments that you've chosen to use to create your painting. We're going to be looking at quite a limited palette today. Obviously, typically people might use lots of different types of colours when they paint. We're just going to be looking at using 4 different pigments. And it's going to show you the range of different colours that can be produced from 3 primaries. Colour wheels like this can be made from any set of colours you like, so you could have 3 different types of blues and see what kind of subtle shifts between blues are possible. What a colour wheel will show you is the gamut that's available with a particular set of colours. So it'll show you the full range that you could possibly use in a painting, and depending on the types of pigments you use, the gamut will shift one way or the other. So if you were to use a strong red and a weak yellow and blue, your painting will tend to have quite a reddish cast to it, like a reddish, general reddish look. Conversely, if you would have a strong yellow but a weak red and a weak blue, it would end up looking quite yellow. So it's a good way to sort of explore the potential in the palette that you're working with, and it's a good way to start if you're beginning painting to get going with how to handle paint and what you can do with mixing. People very often mix a bit too much when they first start, and they often buy too many different types of colours, and it just overcomplicates things. So this is a really good exercise when you're just beginning to get used to mixing paint and controlling how you mix paint, and also just to see how paints mix together. So today I'm going to be using a sort of a set of primaries. So I've got a cadmium red, Prussian blue, which is quite a strong blue, and cadmium yellow. So they're all very strong, high tinting strength colours, and it'll produce quite a bright gamut, quite a full range of possible colours. You can do a version of this where you would use, say, cadmium yellow and then maybe Venetian red or Indian red, which is less high chroma than cadmium red. Or you could use a less high chroma blue. You could even use black as your blue and see how that affects things. So yeah, mix in and out depending on what you have available to you. You can pretty much use any set of colours you like when you're producing a colour wheel. What is interesting is how they interact with one another. And after we've produced the sort of mixes between the 3 different pigments, we're then going to do a second set of mixtures using white, which is my 4th colour, to produce tints. So a tint is basically a lightened version of a mixed colour or a pure colour. And we'll see how white affects each of those colours as well, and it'll also give us an idea of, if we were painting with white mixed in, how it'll affect the colours. Obviously it'll lighten them, and it'll also reduce the chroma. So the outside ring will basically be the strongest possible version of all those colours that you could make. And the final thing we'll do is, in the middle of the circle, we will be mixing a kind of a combination of all of them together. So a bit of white mixed in, and all the different pigments, which will usually just make a brown colour of some sort, but that'll show you the neutral. So these are obviously all the pure mixtures, but when you start to mix across the wheel, you'll get complementaries mixing together and creating greys. So there's a lot of potential in very limited palettes, and that's something that we want to look at today. So to begin with, I'm going to just start with pick up my brush. So I'm just using probably just one brush today. You're going to have to clean your brush quite a lot during this exercise, because it's important that you don't sort of taint any of the colours with each other when you're trying to put the pure forms in. So I'm going to begin placing the pure version of each colour just straight out of the tube. So if I just swivel across a bit, you can see the paints just out on my palette there. So we've got titanium white, cadmium yellow, cadmium red, and Prussian blue. So I'm going to be mixing them, mostly mixing them on the panel, but I'll be picking them up from here initially. I've also got a little bit of medium to work from as well, just to make things a bit faster. Just Just get that back in the same position. So I'll begin placing my yellow, which goes in this box here. Use a little bit of medium to make it flow a bit better. So you can see it's quite a vivid yellow and quite light in value straight out of the tube. So this is basically, this would be the darkest pure yellow that you could produce when you're making your painting. As you mix into it, it'll get darker. Obviously if you add white to it, it'll get lighter, but you'll lose that intensity of yellow that you see here. So I've got that placed now. So I'm going to clean off my brush as much as possible. Actually, I might, to speed things up a bit, I will use several brushes just to save me the hassle of constantly cleaning while I'm trying to paint. So next I'll place my red. So that goes 3 boxes away from the yellow. There's going to be 3 intervals. So one evenly mixed version in the center of the 3 spaces between the colours, and then one that leans towards the colour next to it, and the other that leans towards the opposite colour. But you'll see how that works as we carry on. Just clean this red off. Mostly got it, I think. So now we're going to be adding our blue, which will look pretty dark on your screens, I think. This blue won't really start to show until it's mixed with anything else. Prussian blue is quite a dark blue, but very high chroma. Useful for shadows and that sort of thing. So you'll notice the blue is much darker, a much darker value than the other 2 pigments. So the next thing we're going to do is mix the first interval, which will actually be the central interval between, in this case I'll do blue and yellow. So the Prussian blue and the CAD yellow, and I'm going to try to mix them as much as possible, just an even step in between the 2. So you want to mix it, just show how to go about this. So you'll find if you were to add a bit of Prussian blue, the green will start to get more blue. If you go back and add some yellow, obviously it'll shift back towards a yellow green. So these 2 colours will always make a green, but they'll make either a green that's either more yellow or more blue. And what we're looking for is, as much as possible, the average between these 2. So about there seems pretty good. This will be something that you will adjust later. Get back to my wheel. Zoom back out. So this green that I've just mixed will be placed here, and hopefully I've managed a fairly decent average. So yeah, it's a fairly nice primary green, that. Now, what I'll do is mix the 2 subsequent intervals. So what I'm going to end up with is a more yellow green, and here I'll be making it a more blue green. So to do that, if I start with a yellow green, I just take that original mixture and add a bit more yellow into it until feel like it's shifted sufficiently towards being somewhere in between the yellow and that middle green. So I can now place this on my canvas. So one thing I've noticed doing this is that the Prussian blue has a stronger tinting strength than the CAD yellow. So I've had to use a lot more CAD yellow than Prussian blue to get this interval. And I might even adjust it more by painting a little bit more pure CAD yellow into it, because I still feel like it's not quite in between the yellow and the green, but it's getting pretty close now. So it's these sorts of things that you'll be discovering as you produce your color wheel. So it's a great way to learn about how different pigments interact with each other. So yeah, that's not a bad average. So I'm going to wipe my brush off a bit. It's not so crucial wiping your brush off excessively when you're just working with a single mixture. And then I'm going to go back and return to this this average green and add just a touch of Prussian blue. As I said, that Prussian blue is a lot stronger, has a lot stronger tinting strength than the yellow, so I'm not going to need a lot of it to get this average step. So you'll notice the other major shift that's occurring is a shift in value. Obviously the Prussian blue is a lot darker, so as the green is getting more of a blue green, it's becoming a dark blue green, whereas as it's a yellow green, it's becoming a light yellow green. But that pretty much does it for that portion. I'm now going to move, I've still got a little bit of Prussian blue left on this brush, so I'm going to shift back to my Prussian blue, but this time I'm going to be mixing what will be a purple. So taking a bit of Prussian blue and mixing it with this CAD red. And quite quickly I think we've got a reasonable average. So I go back to my wheel. So I'm just going to shift my tripod up a bit just to get slightly clearer, getting a bit of reflection on the top colours, but it's not the end of the world. Maybe shift slightly over and see if that helps. That's a bit better, I think. So yeah, I'm now going to place this interval here. That's not a bad average. Now hopefully you're getting the idea, so I'm going to speed the process along a bit and mix my next red step. So this is my red with a little bit of Prussian blue mixed in. And then go back and make my bluish step. Which is really, that blue and red are really neutralizing each other. So, I'm now going to just quickly give one of my brushes a thorough clean, because otherwise I'm going to end up with a bit of blue mixed in with my too much blue mixed in with my red-yellow mixture, which will obviously be a grey. Sorry, not an orange, not a grey. Really the opposite of a grey. So I've got a reasonably clean brush now, and once again go back. So this time I'll be picking up OCAD yellow and orange. So one thing you want to try to avoid is when you're picking up paint from your little pool out of the tube, you don't want to leave behind too much. Of the previous colour. So I feel like with this one I've probably gone a little bit too reddish. Once again, the cad yellow's been quite, well, seems to be quite a weak tint strength relative to the red, much like it was quite weak against the Prussian blue. So to create an average I'm going to need a lot more of the yellow. Seems to be about what we're going to get. And then I'm going to mix an almost pure version of the yellow, which is only going to require just a touch. So these steps, they're quite intuitive. There's no kind of absolute, because different paints have different tinting strengths. You're going to have to feel around a bit to get something that's a visual average, even if it's not actually an average of the mixture. So it's not just a case of mixing exactly the same amount of red and yellow together to make the right orange. What you're doing is you're trying to figure out how strong one pigment is compared to the other. Oop. Unexpectedly picked up a little bit of blue there. So if anything like this happens, I recommend you wipe off There we go. So we've got our outer ring form now, reasonably effectively. So what we can begin doing is finding our tints. So I recommend when you start with your tints you just work in the same set of colours you've just been mixing, and it's really just a case of mixing a little bit of white in with all the previous mixtures. So you would mix bit of white into your, probably a little bit more white than that. We want the tint to be pretty evident. These are quite high tinting strength colours, which means that they require more white to lighten them sufficiently. So as you whiten them, you'll notice they go a lot more grey. You can give your brush a pretty decent clean and then move to the pure versions of the colours. So now I'm going to be doing just a pure red tint. So that's just going back to pure cadmium red with a bit of white mixed in. Which makes for a fairly vivid pink by the looks of it. And clean my brush again. Shift back to OCAD yellow. Do the same for it. Lighten that a little bit more just to make it more distinct from pure yellow. Now I can shift back to my purple brush. A bit of a clean. I'll go back to my blue and red mixtures and then make a tint from that. So you'll find with these darker colours, they really start to open up. With white. So they actually become more apparent what their specific colour is as you light them. But they will still become greyer, as you would expect. So this is where things tend to get a bit messy, but try to keep control as much as possible of what's going on with your palette. Try to keep all your mixtures as distinct as possible. But you will find it starts to get a bit trickier at this point. So don't be worried if you start to get a little bit of unwanted mixture creeping in. So that pretty much does us for the purples. They've gone pretty grey, those purples, which is interesting to note. Makes for quite a nice set of greys. And finally, we can go back to our greens. Produce our final set of tints. So beginning with the yellow-green. Decided to take another brush out just to keep things as neat as possible. So that one came together quite quickly, and then going back to the intermediate green. One thing interesting to note about this palette is it produces some nice vivid greens. Cad yellow and Prussian blue as a mixture make for a good set of greens. It's actually one of my main mixtures on my landscape painting palette. Not so strong on the oranges, but for a landscape palette that's completely fine, because certainly in a sort of European context where I paint, you're mostly faced with lots of greens and blues, some browns, but most of the browns are quite muted, so this range actually works quite well. The only exception being when you're painting a vivid sunset. So you maybe want to experiment with a different limited palette if you were trying to capture a sunset. Tint 4 is pure Prussian, and be a fun one to put down because Prussian tints are nice and strong. Prussian's a very strong pigment, and it mixes nicely with white to make for quite a vivid blue. And finally, the fun bit, you can just mix everything together. Some of your whites, yellows, blues on your palette. You can just smear across everything till you get something that just seems like a pretty average grey. So if it seems a bit too green maybe you can add a bit more yellow back in. If that starts to go a bit too green, you can go back to red. If that gets too orange, and you can mix a bit of white in to grey it down even more, and end up with a nice muddy grey. So this grey is what you'll end up with if you overmix all of your colours. But equally it shows what happens when you neutralise your palette. And there you have it. So that's the colour wheel. So you basically, it's a fairly straightforward process. It takes a bit of time because you're obviously having to make sure you manage your palette properly and you're not over-mixing things or tainting each other, tainting colours with one another. So having quite a big palette where everything's quite distinct. I've got a fairly messy palette that I work with, which will make it trickier for you if you're just beginning. So I recommend as a beginner having a nice clean palette, making sure your colours are quite far apart, doing all your mixtures one by one, cleaning your brushes in between, just to keep things manageable. Otherwise you'll find everything starts to get a bit muddy. But what you ideally want is this sort of fairly clean, crisp colour wheel that shows off all the different mixtures fairly effectively. And then it becomes a reference when you're working with this particular palette, and you can see what possibilities there are with it, what limitations as well. You wouldn't want to tackle a subject that, in this instance, maybe had very strong purples. You'd probably want to look for a different pigment to produce your purples, or even oranges, as they had tended to go a bit grey in this one. So yeah, it's a great way to explore possibilities, even if you're a fairly experienced painter. But as a beginner, it's a good way to learn about mixing in a fairly controlled manner, and also to see sort of the range that you can get from just 4 different pigments, which is quite impressive. People, I think, often think they have to buy a specific colour for each different pigment, a different tube for greens, a different tube for purples, and you really don't. You just need a fairly effective limited palette that can produce all of these different mixtures, and it's a good way to get going because you learn a lot about mixing that way, and over time you can add more complex colours into your palette, but I recommend a limited palette like this to begin with is good. So yeah, that's it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the lesson, and I'll see you guys next week. Thanks.